For 13 years, he lived a double life, just miles from the beach where he buried his secrets. He was a husband, a father, an architect who designed office buildings in Manhattan. His neighbors in Massapequa Park called him ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. But police say that behind that ordinary life was one of the most prolific serial killers in modern American history. A man who allegedly strangled women, wrapped their bodies in burlap, and left them along a desolate stretch of Long Island coastline known as Gilgo Beach. For over a decade, investigators chased ghosts. They followed dead ends. They watched the case grow cold, then colder, while a killer allegedly walked free. Sometimes, it's believed, driving right past the very beach where he left his victims. Then, in July 2023, everything changed. A team of investigators, using evidence buried for years in old case files, closed in on a suspect nobody saw coming. This is the story of how one of America's most infamous unsolved murder mysteries finally came to an end. Stick around until the end, because the way they caught him will genuinely shock you. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this channel covers true crime cases just like this one every week. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And if you find this story as gripping as we do, drop a like right now. It really helps this channel grow. Okay, let's get into it. Gilgo Beach sits on a barrier island along the south shore of Long Island, New York. A strip of sand dunes and scrub brush that separates the Great South Bay from the Atlantic Ocean. In the summer, it's the kind of place families go for a quiet day at the shore. Ocean Parkway cuts through it, a long, lonely highway flanked by marshland and thick brush. But for one detective, a routine search in December 2010 would turn this peaceful shoreline into the center of a nightmare. Police were searching for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert, who had vanished months earlier after running from a client's home nearby. During that search, a cadaver dog picked up a scent along Ocean Parkway. What officers found wasn't Shannon. It was the remains of another woman, wrapped in burlap. They kept searching. Within days, they found 3 more sets of remains, all within a short distance of each other. Then more remains turned up in the surrounding area over the following months and years. Some connected to the original case, some believed to be from entirely separate incidents, stretching back decades. What began as a single missing persons search had exploded into something far larger, a cluster of unsolved killings that stretched back to at least the early 1990s, all linked, however loosely, to this same stretch of coastline. The case became known nationwide as the Gilgo Beach murders, or, in the tabloids, the Long Island serial killer case. For over a decade, it remained one of the most notorious unsolved serial murder investigations in the country. Books were written about it, documentaries were made, theories multiplied, and still no arrest. Today, we're going to walk through how this case unfolded, from the discovery of the remains, to the years of frustrating dead ends, to the breakthrough that finally led investigators to a suspect. But before we get to the investigation, we need to talk about the victims. Because in cases like this, it's easy for the human beings at the center of the story to get lost in the sensationalism. We're not going to let that happen here. The first 4 sets of remains discovered in December 2010 became known as the Gilgo 4. These were 4 young women, Melissa Barthelemy, Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainard-Barnes. Melissa Barthelemy was 24 years old when she disappeared in July 2009. She had grown up in Buffalo, New York, and moved to New York City. Her family described her as a devoted daughter and sister. In the days after she went missing, her younger sister received disturbing phone calls from an unknown man taunting her about Melissa's disappearance. Calls investigators would later revisit as a critical piece of evidence. Waterman was 22, originally from Maine, and had a young daughter. Her mother spent years advocating publicly for the investigation to continue, refusing to let her daughter's case fade from public attention. Amber Costello was 27 and living on Long Island, at the time of her disappearance in September 2010. Friends described her as warm and well-liked, someone who had been trying to turn her life around. Maureen Brainard-Barnes was 25, a mother of 2 young children from Connecticut, who had traveled to New York City and never returned home. Her sister has spoken publicly about the decades of uncertainty that followed, the survivor's guilt of wondering whether more could have been done. All 4 women had, at various points in their lives, done sex work, a fact that investigators and advocates later said may have contributed to the years of delay in taking their disappearances seriously. As one victim's family member put it during a later court proceeding, every one of these women was a complete person, a mother, a daughter, an aunt, someone deeply loved, long before they were reduced to a label. As the investigation expanded in the years that followed, additional victims were linked to the case, though not always to the same suspect. These included Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old whose partial remains had actually been discovered years earlier in 2003, but weren't connected to the broader case until later. Valerie Mack, 24, whose remains were found in 2 separate locations years apart, and Sandra Costilla, 28, whose case dated back to the early 1990s, long before the Gilgo 4 were ever found. Investigators also uncovered the remains of additional unidentified individuals in the surrounding area, including a woman known for years only as Peaches and her young daughter, a case that, as we'll discuss later, ultimately led investigators down an entirely separate path from the one that ended with Rex Heuermann. To this day, at least one victim, referred to publicly as Asian Doe, remains unidentified, and investigators continue working to give her a name. Identifying these remains and notifying families was its own agonizing process, often taking years and relying on advances in forensic technology that didn't exist when the bodies were first discovered. For families, it meant a wait that stretched on for over a decade, filled with as much uncertainty as grief. If you're finding this case as unsettling as we do, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We cover cases like this every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming later in this video. For the better part of a decade, the Gilgo Beach case sat in a strange, frustrating limbo. Detectives had bodies. They had a rough timeline. What they didn't have was a suspect who fit. The investigation was hampered by a number of factors. The remains had been left in a remote, overgrown area, exposed to the elements for months or years before discovery, which degraded much of the physical evidence. Many of the victims had been reported missing weeks or months before their remains were found, meaning any trail investigators might have followed had already gone cold. And because several of the victims had worked in the sex trade and advertised through the same online platforms, some investigators believed their cases weren't given the same urgency as other missing persons cases might have received. Over the years, the public speculation around the case grew into its own kind of phenomenon. Because remains linked to different time periods and potentially different perpetrators kept surfacing in the same general area, theories multiplied. Was this one killer? Multiple killers using the same dumping ground? A local resident? Someone connected to law enforcement, given how remote and hard to find the location was? Tabloids ran with nicknames like the Long Island Ripper. True crime podcasts and documentaries picked apart every detail. Some theories pointed to random suspects, with no real evidence connecting them. It's important to say clearly, much of what circulated publicly during this period was speculation, not established fact, and we're not going to repeat unproven theories here as though they were confirmed. What we can say is that the case created enormous pressure on Suffolk County law enforcement. Leadership changes within the police department and the district attorney's office came and went. Task forces were formed and, at times, seemed to stall. Victims' families grew increasingly vocal in their frustration, some publicly accusing investigators of not doing enough, particularly in the early years. Then, in 2022, that pressure, combined with new leadership, set the stage for a fundamental shift in how the case was being handled. In January 2022, Suffolk County's newly elected District Attorney Ray Tierney made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire case. He created a dedicated task force specifically to take a fresh look at the Gilgo Beach murders, bringing in investigators from multiple agencies, including the FBI, to comb back through more than a decade of case files with modern tools that simply didn't exist when the bodies were first found. This wasn't about starting from scratch. It was about applying new forensic technology and a fresh set of eyes to evidence that had been sitting untouched for years. One of the biggest breakthroughs came from cell phone records. Investigators went back through call data connected to burner phones used to contact several of the victims, including that disturbing call made to Melissa Barthelemy's teenage sister back in 2009. By analyzing which cell towers the burner phones connected to, and cross-referencing that data with the movements of a personal phone believed to belong to the same individual, investigators say they were able to place a single person in the vicinity of multiple crime scenes and victim contacts over a span of years. Digital and paper trail evidence connected to a Chevrolet Avalanche truck, a vehicle description that a witness had actually given to police years earlier in connection with one of the victims, reportedly helped narrow the search further. By early 2023, investigators say the pattern of evidence had converged on a single name: Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect who lived in Massapequa Park, roughly a 30-minute drive from Gilgo Beach, and who kept an office in Manhattan. To be clear about what follows, everything in the investigative process described below reflects what prosecutors and investigators presented in court filings and public statements. As we'll cover shortly, this case was ultimately resolved through a guilty plea, which means these allegations were formally acknowledged by the defendant himself in court. But at the time these investigative steps were taken, Heuermann was, like anyone under investigation, presumed innocent. Once investigators had a name, they needed something ironclad, physical evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court. That meant surveillance. For weeks, investigators reportedly conducted covert surveillance on Heuermann, watching his movements between his Massapequa Park home and his Manhattan office. According to court documents, investigators were eventually able to collect discarded items connected to Heuermann for forensic testing, including, notably, a pizza crust he had thrown away near his Midtown office. From that discarded item, investigators say they recovered a DNA sample. That sample was reportedly compared to DNA recovered from a hair found on or near one of the victims decades earlier, degraded, but preserved well enough for modern forensic techniques to analyze. Investigators say the samples were a match. On July 13, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested outside his Manhattan office. He was initially charged with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo 4 victims, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Sandra Costilla, with prosecutors noting he remained a prime suspect in the 4th, Maureen Brainard-Barnes. The court filing laid out by prosecutors at the time ran more than 30 pages, detailing the surveillance, the DNA analysis, phone records, and other evidence that had led investigators to this moment. Given the scope of the allegations, the court ordered Heuermann held without bail. At the time of his arrest, these were allegations, serious, extensively documented allegations, but allegations nonetheless, and Heuermann pleaded not guilty to the initial charges. In the months that followed, prosecutors brought additional charges connecting him to Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Sandra Costilla, bringing the total number of murder charges to 7. Throughout this period, and as is the right of every defendant in the American justice system, Heuermann maintained his innocence, and his defense team fought the charges, challenging elements of the DNA evidence, and seeking separate trials for different sets of charges. A judge ultimately ruled that all 7 counts would be tried together. This is the point in the video where, if you haven't already, we'd really appreciate you hitting that like button and sharing this video with someone who's into true crime. It genuinely helps us keep making videos like this one. Now, let's talk about who Rex Heuermann actually was and why this arrest shocked so many people who knew him. To understand why this arrest sent shockwaves through the community, you have to understand who Rex Heuermann appeared to be before July 2023. Heuermann was a licensed architect who ran his own firm, working out of an office in Manhattan for years. Colleagues in the architecture and real estate world described him as professional, if unremarkable. Someone who showed up, did his work, and didn't draw attention to himself. He was married and had raised children. He'd lived for years in the same modest home in Massapequa Park, a quiet Long Island suburb not far from where several of the victims were believed to have disappeared, and roughly a 30-minute drive from Gilgo Beach itself. Neighbors, in interviews after the arrest, repeatedly used words like normal and quiet to describe him. Nobody flagged him as suspicious. Nobody had reported concerning behavior. By every outward measure, he blended into the fabric of suburban Long Island life. That, of course, is precisely what made the allegations against him so deeply unsettling to the public. This wasn't a transient with a history of violence. This wasn't someone on law enforcement's radar. This was, by all outward appearances, an ordinary professional, hiding, prosecutors would later allege, an entirely different life behind closed doors. His family has said publicly, in various interviews, that they were blindsided by the arrest. In fact, one of his own daughters would later tell reporters she believed he was likely responsible for the killings, a statement that captured just how much this case forced even those closest to him to reckon with a person they thought they knew. Oh, what, specifically, did prosecutors say connected Rex Heuermann to these murders? The centerpiece of the case was DNA evidence. Prosecutors alleged that DNA recovered from hairs found on or near several of the victims matched genetic material collected from items Heuermann discarded, including that pizza crust thrown away near his office, and, according to later reporting, additional discarded items collected during the investigation. His defense team challenged the reliability of some of this testing, particularly newer forensic genealogy techniques, arguing in pretrial hearings that the science behind certain DNA matches was still developing and shouldn't be treated as conclusive. A judge ultimately ruled, after extensive hearings, that this DNA evidence would be admissible at trial. Cell phone analysis formed a second major pillar of the case. Prosecutors alleged that burner phones used to contact victims, including the disturbing calls made to Melissa Barthelemy's sister, could be tracked, through cell tower data, to locations consistent with Heuermann's known movements between his home, his office, and other locations relevant to the case. Investigators also alleged that a burner phone used in connection with the case had been purchased using a credit card traceable back to Heuermann. According to court filings, investigators also cited digital evidence, including searches and documents recovered from Heuermann's devices, which prosecutors described as demonstrating both an ongoing preoccupation with the case and, disturbingly, planning-related material. It's important to note that at every stage of the pretrial process, these were characterized by prosecutors as allegations to be tested at trial, not proven facts, and Heuermann's defense team disputed the significance and interpretation of much of this material. Investigators also said they recovered more than 300 firearms from Heuermann's home during searches conducted after his arrest, though that fact, while widely reported, was separate from the murder charges themselves. As we'll cover next, this case never actually went to the trial that had been scheduled, because in the spring of 2026, the legal process reached its resolution a different way. For Long Island, and particularly for Suffolk County, the arrest of Rex Heuermann was seismic. For over a decade, the Gilgo Beach murders had cast a shadow over the region. Local residents grew used to national news crews descending on their community every time new remains were found, or a new theory made headlines. Some residents described a lingering unease about the case. the knowledge that whoever was responsible might still be living among them, going about ordinary life. When news broke of Heuermann's arrest, that unease turned into something closer to disbelief. Here was a man who had, by many accounts, lived an unremarkable suburban life, just minutes from where he's accused of committing his crimes, reportedly even continuing to live in the same home throughout the entire period. Investigators say he was under scrutiny. For the victims' families, the arrest brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that, after so many years, there might finally be answers, but also renewed grief, as the details of the case returned to the headlines. Several family members spoke publicly in the months following the arrest, describing a case that had defined and disrupted their lives for over a decade. Some expressed frustration that it had taken this long, pointing to years in which their loved ones' cases sat without meaningful movement. For investigators and law enforcement officials who had worked the case across multiple administrations, the arrest represented a kind of vindication, proof that patience, modern forensic tools, and a willingness to revisit old evidence with fresh eyes could still crack even the coldest of cases. If this case has kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next deep dive. And if you haven't already, drop a like on this video. It genuinely makes a difference for this channel. Here's where the case stands as of the most recent public developments. In April 2026, Rex Heuermann pleaded guilty in Suffolk County Court to 7 counts of murder, 3 counts of first-degree murder, and 4 counts of second-degree murder, connected to Melissa Barthelemy, Waterman, Sandra Costilla, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Sandra Costilla. As part of the plea agreement, he also admitted, in court, to killing an 8th woman, Karen Vergata, though he was not formally charged in her death as part of the deal, and he waived his right to appeal in exchange for the prosecution, agreeing not to pursue further charges connected to that death. In June 2026, a judge formally sentenced Heuermann to life in prison without the possibility of parole, 3 consecutive life sentences for the first-degree murder counts, plus 25 years to life on each of the second-degree counts, all to be served consecutively. During the sentencing hearing, family members of the victims addressed Heuermann directly in emotional, at times searing testimony, describing the decades of pain his actions had caused and reclaiming the humanity of the women he killed. It's worth noting that the broader Gilgo Beach case remains, in some respects, still open. In December 2025, a separate suspect, Andrew Dykes, was arrested and linked to the deaths of a woman known publicly for years only as Peaches and her young daughter, a case investigators had, for a long time, associated with the same general theory of a single, Long Island serial killer. That arrest served as a reminder that not every case connected to this stretch of coastline can be attributed to one person, and at least one victim, Asian Doe, remains unidentified, with investigators continuing to use advanced genetic genealogy techniques in hopes of eventually giving her a name and, potentially, her own measure of justice. Because this case reached its conclusion through a guilty plea and a formal court sentencing, Rex Heuermann's legal responsibility for these 7 murders, and his admission regarding an 8th, is no longer merely an allegation. It has been established through his own admission in a court of law. That said, developments connected to the broader Gilgo Beach investigation, including unidentified victims and other suspects, remain ongoing and will continue to follow this story as it develops. At the center of this entire case are 8 women whose lives were taken from them, women who were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, long before they became headlines. Melissa Barthelemy, Waterman, Sandra Costilla, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, Sandra Costilla, Karen Vergata. For over a decade, their cases sat unresolved, and their families lived with a particular kind of grief, one without answers, without closure, and for some, without the sense that their loved ones' lives were treated with the urgency they deserved. The eventual resolution of this case doesn't undo those years. But it does, finally, give these families something they were owed for a very long time: the truth, spoken aloud, in a courtroom, by the man responsible. This case is also a reminder of how justice, however delayed, often depends on patience, persistence, and a willingness to look at old evidence in new ways. It took modern forensic science, a renewed investigative effort, and years of painstaking work to bring this case to its conclusion. And even now, questions remain about Asian Doe, about the full scope of what happened along that quiet stretch of Long Island coastline, and about how a case like this could go unresolved for as long as it did. If there's one thing this story leaves us with, it's this: behind every cold case are real people who deserve to be remembered as more than victims, and a reminder that justice, even when it takes over a decade, is still worth pursuing. Thank you so much for watching this video. If this case moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone, and subscribe with notifications turned on so you catch our next true crime deep dive the moment it goes live. We've got more cases just like this one waiting for you. Go check out our other true crime videos linked right here on screen. As always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.